So in Islam, there's very much the belief that we are not alone in the universe, that we are not alone in the cosmos, that in addition to God, in addition to angels, in addition to animals and plants, there are otherworldly, extraterrestrial forms of intelligent beings.
I can't help but feel, given how tough organisms are on Earth, these so-called extremophiles, that feels something that's likely to be found. And equally, we've got these amazing, a whole array of probes now that are capable of analyzing the atmosphere of exoplanets and detecting life signs.
Hello, Roger.
Hi there, Matthias.
Such a great pleasure to speak to you. I've read many of your books, many of your articles. Not, of course, nearly, not nearly, well, I could say not nearly most of them, because I know you've published thousands of articles as a journalist alone, in addition to obviously the books and the blog articles. But even though I've read a lot by you, I would still be very, very interested in finding out how you became a writer who would write for popular audiences. You have a PhD, you started out as a research scientist, and then you branched out. How did that happen?
Well, it's all down to a combination of Margaret Thatcher and Chernobyl, basically. But when I was doing my doctorate, I used to bounce neutrons off soap bubbles in a French reactor called the Institut La Langevin. And there was a lot of downtime between experiments. So I worked for the university newspaper and in fact managed to get a couple of stories into national papers as well. And then when it came to doing my postdoc, my tutor said to me, or my supervisor said that, Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, was cutting back on British research. And he said, look, you seem to you have a sort of thing about journalism. Why don't you try and become a journalist? And if it doesn't work out, you can come back and do a postdoc. So he kind of gave me a safety net to experiment. And then I worked on a medical mag, then a nuclear mag. And as it happened in 86, I was doing a bit of freelancing for The Economist and The Guardian and others at the time. But in 86, I went with a bunch of Scandinavian journalists to Forsmark in Sweden to see a new nuclear dump. And when we were trying to get into the Forsmark nuclear reactor, all the alarms went off. We were confined in the cafe for most of the day. And then the reactor operators came in and said rather dramatically, we've analyzed, we thought it was fallout from our own reactor, but in fact, we realize it's from a graphite moderated reactor, which is a Soviet design. And that's really the very first that the world knew about the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And it took several days of diplomatic pressure on the Soviets before they finally admitted they'd had this terrible accident. And to cut a very long story short, the Daily Telegraph felt it didn't cover the nuclear accident very well. They were very keen to get a technology correspondent to do that, so I was recruited to the Telegraph in 86 and spent 22 years there covering science of all flavors and bashing out books. But of course, you've got an equally kind of eclectic background, Matthias, because you're going from history of science to the Quran to science fiction. How on earth did you go on your journey?
Well, I probably did not know what I was doing or what I was exactly getting into. I had many different interests. As a high school student, I was interested in politics, Middle East politics in particular. I should give a historical background here too. I graduated from high school in 2003, which was the year of the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq. It was 2 years after 9/11. So if you had any interest in world politics, you were probably interested in Middle East politics, which led me to study Arabic, but also to study history. At the same time, I've had a fascination with science fiction. Since being a child, I grew up as a Star Trek fan, to a lesser extent a Star Wars fan as well. But I didn't really know that one could sort of study science fiction professionally. I did not know at the time of any departments of science fiction or programs of science fiction, and to my knowledge, even today, there are very few academic departments that just study science fiction. And at the time, I did not really know about the history of science as a field either, or of a profession, right? That one could become a historian of science. So I sort of learned all of the about all these fields over time as a high school student, then as an undergraduate student at the University of Vienna in Austria, and then as a PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies, part of the University of London, where I first did a PhD on history of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So I had these interests in the Middle East, and I did not really know how to combine them but with interest in science fiction, history of science as well, until sort of I attended more conferences by, for instance, the British Society for the History of Science, and found that there are just so many connections between history of science, culture of science, literature and science, and I started writing about it and found more and more connections, with religion as well, with Islam, with the Quran. So it's been an eclectic journey. I don't recommend anybody sort of to try what I did, but in the end, it did work out for me.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I have had I've done 10 books, and 2 of them are kind of peculiar in the sense that they're dealing with they're trying to blend things that are kind of intellectually orthogonal, and by that I mean science and Christmas with one book, and science and Harry Potter in another book. But I must admit, I loved that aspect of those books because they started off with a subject of huge public interest, and then most people say, well, look, there isn't science in Harry Potter, and there isn't science in Christmas, and I had a lot of fun. I mean, the trick I deployed was not to use the books to attack biblical ideas about Christmas, or heaven forbid, attack Santa Claus, which would just be beyond the pale, or attack Harry Potter, but just to say things like, if you were to deliver presents to every child on the planet in one night, how would you do it? And I had a lot of fun. I mean, the great thing was a lot of scientists played along with this. So, you had the general relativity guys going on about warp drive sleighs, and Miguel Alcubierre, who kind of had the first warp drive outline, on one side. Then I talked to the quantum teleportation people who said, no, Santa obviously uses quantum teleportation. And then similarly, with the Harry Potter book, had a lot of fun. Even had people like Lord May, Robert May, who put chaos into biology, actually ringing me up and saying, I did a jokey paper about the taxonomy of dragons for Nature. You've got to mention my paper in your Harry Potter book. Anyway, and it's similarly, you've done that crossover thing between the Quran and science fiction, which is equally surprising. I mean, how did you find unexpected resonances there? Did your peers ostracize you? How did it go down?
Thank you so much. But did my peers ostracize me? But yes, sort of. I was worried about.
No, that's terrible.
Exactly. I was definitely worried what kind of reactions I would get. Colleagues of mine were also worried about me. Would I be accused of blasphemy by trying to connect the Quran to extraterrestrials? But in some ways, if you think about it, the Quran is a heavenly book. It is connected
Yeah.
to the realm of the heavens, and sort of humans have long associated the the sky with the realm of the gods, of course. So until today, in the English language, right, we have names for planets that are names of gods, right? Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and so on,
Right.
that were part of the original Greco-Roman pantheon. And in Islam as well, there's the notion of there being seven heavens, and these heavens being inhabited. There's God's throne. There are the angels, of course, that you have in the Christian traditions as well. And then there's a peculiar kind of being that exists in the Islamic tradition, which are the jinn,
Yeah.
a form of intelligent, very, very powerful kind of creature
So
that
this is the genie that you see in Aladdin, isn't it, or something like
absolutely,
that?
exactly. So an intelligent being, in some ways more powerful, many ways more powerful than a human. So in another word, like advanced as well, but also sentient, sort of with the ability to make decisions, with the ability to do good or to do evil. So in Islam, there's very much the belief that we are not alone in the universe, that we are not alone in the cosmos, that in addition to God, in addition to angels, in addition to animals and plants, there are otherworldly, extraterrestrial forms of intelligent beings. And
So
yeah, so
that's fascinating that the Quran actually has that kind of extraterrestrial aspect to it. I mean, what did you get any pushback from, religious figures?
no, I was really surprised that a lot of religious figures endorsed very much the idea. I was basing my research on the writing by theologians
Right.
who have often actually interpreted the Quran quite literally. So in the Quran, God is always referred to as the Lord of the worlds in the plural, but never as just
Right.
a Lord of one world. So always the idea that you would have a plurality of worlds, the idea of there being more than one world, is very, very much accepted. And now there are differences in interpretations what exactly these worlds are. However, many believe that there is a world of the humans, and then there is a world of the jinn, and then there might be seven earths in addition to seven heavens, and so on.
Right.
So even quite literal understandings and literal readings of the Quran, uh, uh, yeah, like support these ideas.
I mean, I have to say, I didn't really go through the Bible in detail. I was just interested in the parts to do with the nativity story. And I suppose one of the things I found was that, say, when you took the Bethlehem star and the three wise men, there wasn't quite enough information in the Bible to pin things down. The only thing that really did strike me as a good insight, I talked to a scientist called Mike Molnar at Rutgers, and until I talked to him, a lot of astronomers wanted to find a bright astronomical event as the Bethlehem star, so a comet or the birth of a new star or something like that. And Mike Molnar said, no, the three wise men would have been astrologers. They would have been interested in the symbolism of the heavens and conjunctions of planets and things like that. It was a much more convincing picture. And of course, it's an interesting point that astrology and astronomy, both start off with detailed observations of the heavens. And I found that, that you could just about make a convincing connection or at least Mike Molnar did, and speculate about the date of Jesus's birth and so on. But equally, I didn't exactly get into trouble with it's called Can Reindeer Fly in the UK, or the Physics of Christmas in the US. But actually, the US edition is lacking a chapter, and my editor in the States, a chap who I really respect, but he said, I really don't think you can have the virgin birth chapter. And I had various speculative genetic schemes about how, Jesus was born, and discussing parthenogenesis and goodness knows what else. Now, I must admit, I said to him, look, if people are offended by that in the Baptist belt of the States and they start burning the book in shopping malls, isn't that great publicity? Fantastic. But anyway, he took a quite different view. So actually, if you look at the American edition of the book, it is minus one chapter that's in the British edition, which is kind of fascinating. But in fact, the book was translated. The publisher. I had one publisher at the start, and then Rick Cott from Penguin got interested. But it was a real effort to get anyone interested in that book. But in the end, it got lots of lovely reviews and lots of foreign editions. So I'm a great believer in these sort of crossover books now.
Oh, that's fascinating.
In fact, I was thinking, Matthias, you've got to, given all the resonances around Islamic thinking and so on in Dune, that somehow there has to be, and given where you're based at the moment, there has to be a Science of Dune book for you to write. Surely that's a great fit.
Thank you so much. Yes, in fact, a Science of Dune book has already been written.
I think yours would be much better, though, of course.
Thank you so much. But I agree that Dune is a fascinating subject, right? You can look at the science of Dune, right? The ecology of that desert planet, the ideas about space travel, of course. But you can also look at the political science, at the sociology and the anthropology of Dune, so more the social scientific aspects of Dune. And you're right, for somebody like me who is based in the Middle East. I've been in Qatar, in the Gulf, for the last 12 years, which is an oil state. There are so many metaphors about modern Arab history in particular. So if you just scratch a little bit beneath the surface, right? So in Dune, the struggle is about spice, which is a substance that is essential to interstellar navigation. That's really a barely veiled sort of code for oil, right? Sort of oil in the 20th century being the primary resource for navigation on our planet. So you have an empire with an emperor. Again, sort of you can think about it as a metaphor for the British Empire or the American Empire, trying to manipulate these different royal houses against one another, right? Sort of playing the House of Atreides against the House of Harkonnen. You could see this very much as let's say, the British Empire or the American Empire playing these different ruling houses of the Arab world against one another in order to ultimately take control of the extraction of oil, of that resource on which the empire depends. So, of course, Dune was first written in the 1960s. This was the decade when OPEC came about, when sort of petroleum exporting countries were trying to free themselves of the Western oil companies, were trying to sort of essentially get a better deal, just like the planet, the inhabitants of Arrakis are ultimately trying to get a better deal, getting a better arrangement, even though the native inhabitants of Arrakis are obviously being screwed over. again and again, just like you can say sort of the indigenous peoples of Earth who happen to live on top of resource-rich land have been sort of screwed over again and again. So there are sort of many fascinating parallels between Dune and earthly history.
I must admit, I've got my 70s vintage copy of Dune somewhere in the house. The rather plump Frank Herbert one, which I think was 3 books combined or something like that. How did clearly that Dune's had 2 Hollywood airings. I must admit, I think the second one is much more impressive than the first, which I wasn't that impressed by. But what was the reception in the Middle East? Because obviously it is airing some quite edgy subjects. Was it just locally just seen as just another bit of sci-fi entertainment, or did people pick up on the undercurrents?
Very good question as well. So the most recent Dune movies were actually in part shot in the Arab world,
Right.
and with support of Arab countries. And there's a long tradition of Arab countries serving as locations for the shooting of science fiction films. Of course, the other franchise featuring a very famous desert planet is Star Wars, which has its desert planet, the most famous one being Tatooine, which is named after a town in Tunisia, Tunisia in the 1970s. And until today, science fiction movies, especially those featuring desert planets, are often shot in Arab countries. So the most recent Dune movie being shot in Jordan and also in the United Arab Emirates, if I'm not mistaken. So Arab countries have in fact been supportive of this kind of science fiction. Now, when Dune was first written in the 1960s, we were living in a different world at the time. This was the 1960s. At the time, political Islam was not seen as threatening to Western audiences at the time. So, for instance, Frank Herbert wrote about a jihad being waged, the Sharia being followed, and so on. And especially with the newest Dune films that were obviously made in a world after the attacks of September 11th, after the War on Terror, there's very, very little of Sharia being mentioned, of jihad being mentioned, at least in the first installment of the new Dune movies. There were hardly any Arab actors involved, even though Frank Herbert obviously modeled the native peoples of Arrakis after Arabs and Muslims. But by the filmmakers, it was still perhaps seen as too sensitive to make the people of Arrakis too much like Arabs and Muslims today, even though the films were shot in the landscapes of Arab and Muslim countries.
I mean, it's always interesting, isn't it, to speculate on the nature of science fiction. And in fact, a couple of years ago, my day job, I work at the Science Museum in London. It's one of 5 museums in a group that we run. And we actually had a science fiction exhibition. And we focused on how there was, a constant sort of there are so many issues, about why people write science fiction. I think you've alluded to some of them, that sometimes in a world far, far away, you can talk in a more honest way or less encumbered way about the pressing geopolitical concerns that you've got here on Earth right now. We were interested in the constant interplay between sci-fi and science fiction. Maybe perhaps most dramatically when you look at the birth of the space age. The Russians were sort of infatuated with space travel and the possibilities of space and exploring space and colonizing space at the end of the 19th century in the Cosmos movement. And there were kind of great trade shows in Moscow in the 20s talking about these things. So although people, there's a technological story about space exploration, which is basically, the German V2 weapon really launched both the US and the Soviet space programs. But I think the reason the Soviets really dominated early space exploration was I think there was so much big thinking and romance about space exploration that had gone on for decades earlier. There was a kind of inevitability about it, and the start of the 60s were kind of amazing. And in fact, earlier in the museum, we had Tereshkova in the museum. First woman in space, only woman to fly solo in space. First civilian in space. She declared she wanted to. If Elon Musk was sending someone back to Mars, she'd be quite happily on that spaceship. And people like Alexei Leonov, the first spacewalker. Amazing figures from the dawn of the space age. And again, you can trace it back to the cosmists, these sort of mystical ideas, a lot of interest in Jules Verne and H.G. Wells at that time. So we thought it was fascinating, this link between the two, Star Trek, things like the medical devices. You can sort of see people trying to ape them even now, communicators. Anyway, all this stuff, Matthias, but so in terms of, how do you see the role of science fiction? Do you think it's really telling us more about today than anything in the future, isn't it? I think, ultimately.
Absolutely. It's always the future that is being imagined by people in a specific point in time. And I love these connections that you make to space programs, to mythologies, and these connections very much resonate with me as a historian of science. You mentioned cosmism, you mentioned Star Trek as well. The idea of Star Trek, a trek, that's the American word for a wagon train that would go to the west. That is, of course, again, a 19th century American mythology of
Right.
the final frontier, of colonizing the West, again, sort of connected with American ideals of freedom, of manifest destiny, of sort of the West being the land that was given to the American settlers, just like in the Bible, you had these ideas of the Holy Land being given to the people of Israel. So these religious ideas, and then in the 20th century, space race as well. You had. At least on the American side, very much religious language still prominent. So Apollo astronauts, famously, they read Genesis in while they were between Earth and Moon. And it is quite fascinating nowadays as well, where if I look at American politics, but where we have a very strong Christian right, very, very conservative political figures. And at the same time, we have all these space enthusiasts like Elon Musk, obviously the owner of SpaceX, also people like Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon and owner of his own space company, Blue Origin. And sort of in the current political landscape, there seems to be almost like an alliance between these space enthusiasts like Elon Musk and the Christian religious right of America that has in part brought, for instance, the Republican Party again to power. So while we sometimes in many countries, maybe the UK included, right, we sometimes think about religion and science as these separate spheres, but historians of science, museums of science can actually show the many, many connections between mythology, religion, space exploration, science, technology, etc.
I have to say, when we opened our science fiction exhibition, we had an advisor who was an astronaut who said very firmly that they were against the idea of science fiction. And we were actually slightly taken aback by this because they felt that it was just all made up and nonsense. But of course, I think there are just so many fascinating links. I mean, if you, for example, look at the Carl Sagan book Contact, I know he wanted to come up with at least a vaguely plausible form of interstellar travel. So I think this is when Kip Thorne and colleagues, and Kip went on to win the Nobel Prize, of course, for gravitational waves, but he came up with a wormhole with when I say plausible, it was kind of mathematically it could work, but I think it required extraordinary kind of matter to keep the more of the wormhole open. But then, interestingly, Kip was very involved in the movie Interstellar, directed by Chris Nolan, and in fact, a friend of mine, Paul Franklin, got the Oscar for the visual effects on Interstellar, and Paul and Kip worked together to produce that amazing image of a black hole in Interstellar. Before then, black holes just seemed to be stuff just going into just like a black plug hole. And of course, they traced how the black hole warps light around it. So it looks, the interstellar black holes look quite different from the ones, say, from the Walt Disney black hole picture, which was pretty creaky many years ago, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, I think they wrote a paper together, and whether it still is, I don't know, but I think it was the most accurate computational investigation of the event horizon and the zones around a black hole, and that all came about because of a Hollywood movie. So I think there are surprising links there. Childhood TV in the UK, there were things like Thunderbirds, and I remember interviewing Jerry Anderson, who came up with all these sort of sci-fi puppet shows like Thunderbirds and Stingray, who told me that he got a lot of letters from NASA engineers saying, I was inspired to join NASA by, the Tracy family in Thunderbirds and so on, which is kind of rather charming. So I think there's always been a lot of fascinating links between the two. And in fact, the other day I was talking to someone who was simulating through physics-based modeling blended with AI how planets evolve over billions of years. And of course, these are mathematical models built on assumptions. And he was predicting what would happen if you took an Earth itself and plonked it in a different orbit around an alien star, in fact, different orbit around our own star, or how these other Earth-like planets would evolve, these exoplanets. And it did strike me that, it's interesting to ask what's the difference between pure science, and then you've got you've got sci-fi aficionados talk about hard sci-fi, which is trying to respect the science and the physics and so on, and then things like these climate models, which are built on assumptions. But it strikes me they almost belong in the camp of hard sci-fi, or maybe I'm being controversial here. I don't know. Are my ramblings making any sense,
Oh,
Matthias?
absolutely. And they make very much sense to me as a historian of science, as well as a historian of science fiction. So if I think about, for instance, the science fiction of the 1920s, 1930s, that we often associate with these pulp magazines edited by people like Hugo Gernsback, who is the person that has given this science fiction field the Hugo Awards through his name. So he, Gernsback, he was a magazine publisher more than a science fiction author, although he did write some science fiction himself as well. But he was a publisher, an editor, an entrepreneur, and he was very, very interested in not just science fiction, but also like innovations, patents, developments, for instance, in radio in particular. And he had these ideas that maybe science fiction authors should be able to patent their ideas in the same way as sort of other kinds of inventors would.
Yeah. In fact, it's funny you say that. When I was at the Telegraph, I got about 3 letters. And in fact, sadly, I think I've thrown through them away. This is in the 80s and early 90s. Was he still alive then? Arthur C. Clarke would write, if you wrote something that he'd foreshadowed in one of his books, he'd always drop you a line to say, if you bothered to read, my book published 15 years ago, you would have noticed I came up with a very similar idea to this that you've been talking about in the Daily Telegraph. So, that's when he was living in Sri Lanka, which is always a bit of a thrill, really, as a 2001 author. So I know what you mean about you could tell he would have patented his ideas if he'd had the chance.
Absolutely. And I think he is very well credited with, quote unquote, inventing the idea of sort of satellite communication. Yeah. But I don't think he put a patent for this in either. No.
But I feel for him, actually. I suppose in a way, this science fiction, we're used to now computer modeling. And the brilliant thing is if you get the physics right, you can glimpse a bit into the future. And obviously sci-fi is a kind of looser version of doing this what if scenario planning. What if this technology ran right? I suppose we're all getting obsessed about AI sci-fi at the moment with the AI revolution.
That's right. And
I don't know whether you've noticed an uptick in AI sci-fi.
That's a good question. AI sci-fi has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
But the word robot is, of course, a word that I think was coined in the 1920s by Karel Čapek,
That's right.
a Czech science fiction author. Then Isaac Asimov, who is perhaps still best known for his robot science fiction. Isaac Asimov was much more of a robot guy than an alien guy in terms of science fiction. He wrote the stories out of which the so-called 3 laws of robotics came around 1950. So over 70 years ago. So we've been thinking about AI for a very, very long time. Nowadays, obviously.
I think one of the headaches we've had, sorry, forgive me for butting in, but you've just triggered a random thought that we actually had a robots exhibition, maybe a decade or so ago. And one of the biggest problems we had was that Hollywood has created huge expectations about humanoid robots, like the Terminator and so on. And actually, when you see real-life humanoid robots, they're a bit disappointing, to be honest. I mean, they're getting pretty good now, but some of them are heavily programmed. They do break down quite a lot. There's some sort of robots Olympiad where they're given a series of tasks to solve, and they're often more comedy than impressive. But we found that the Hollywood ideas about robotics and about superintelligence have really taken a hold, and in a way they've got in the way of realistic discussions about where the technology is now. You know, if you get AI experts, that you can hear them all groan when someone from the audience says, you know, when is a superintelligence going to rise up and the machines enslave us, and et cetera, just like in Terminator.
That's right.
So it's interesting how it can be a barrier as much as help you think through future possibilities.
That's right. And science fiction, right, in some ways has not only the possibility to predict, but also to disappoint. So you mentioned robots, where the robots that we had imagined a long time ago have not become true.
No.
In the same way, right, we had long imagined in the 1960s, 1970s that by now, by the 2020s, we would all have space colonies everywhere. We would have colonized the solar system. We would have built sort of cities on the moon and Mars, and we would be sort of flying about with our spaceships everywhere. And sort of that has not come true in any way like people had imagined in the 1960s and 1970s. But on the other hand, for instance, what people didn't quite predict is the whole sort of microchip revolution, or the idea that computers might be networked. Right? Even in sort of Star Trek, The Next Generation, you still have the idea that the Enterprise would have sort of some giant computer, some giant mainframe computer somewhere in the bowels of that ship. But the idea that maybe a computer could be distributed in a network, like that there might be a Federation Starfleet internet, even sort of in the 1990s, when the internet actually started, seemed to have escaped the Star Trek creators.
Funnily enough, I did an interview with Vint Cerf, who's one of the sort of great architects of the internet, and he's now working on the interplanetary internet. And in fact, it's a different sort of problem. Although I agree with you, but you know, planets get in the way of things, so you have to store information as much as just shuffle it around on the interplanetary internet. But I so agree about your point about space. I mean, if I had to say what was the one thing that got me in love with science, it had to be Apollo. I just found the whole thing riveting, you know, in the 60s. And what I find a little sad now is one of our most iconic objects in the Science Museum, although it's on loan from the Smithsonian, is Apollo 10. And you can see kids looking at it and not really believing that more than 50 years ago, this took 3 men to within a few miles of the moon's surface. In fact, I took Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, several years ago around the museum, and we were being followed by a film crew, and there were some school children there with the teachers, and the teachers they kind of knew he was a VIP, but they didn't quite know who he was. And Jim actually very gamely agreed to be grilled by these school kids, and I had to sort of find a way to introduce him. And at that time, it was a couple of years after the Tom Hanks movie had come out, Apollo 13. So I had to say, well, who's seen Apollo 13? You know, a few hands went up. Do you know who, you know, Tom Hanks? You know, well, this is kind of Tom Hanks who's next to me. And it was actually an electric moment when these kids interrogated him about was he frightened? Because, of course, if you listen to the dialogue, you know, Houston, we've got a problem and all that, they kept a lid on being emotional, but obviously it was mildly terrifying. Well, to to put it understatement of the century. But anyway, all I'm really trying to say is I find it's interesting that Apollo 10 is almost turning into a magical object. When you tell people what it did, they sort of don't believe you. Of course, they only see this little capsule. They don't see the gigantic Saturn V that it was launched on, and all the other kind of paraphernalia. So maybe that's why they don't believe it. But it's and I think it underlines what you're saying, that we haven't really delivered all those Mars and Moon colonies. We thought there'd be dozens of them by now, and it's proved it's surprising what a hard slog it is, even for the recent slew of private missions. It's not gone in a straightforward way getting to the Moon and Mars and so on.
Absolutely. And what is perhaps also astonishing is how much we've forgotten as well, right? So now the American Artemis program is supposed to bring us back to the moon, and you would have thought that should be pretty easy, right? We've done it before. We did it in the 1960s. Obviously, nowadays we have so much better technology. We have computers. Surely we could just sort of start again where we left off the last time. But then so much knowledge has actually been forgotten. Despite the best efforts of the Smithsonian, like you said, the Science Museum, sort of to keep these objects and the history alive. But yeah, if we wanted to sort of bring a human to the moon tomorrow, we couldn't quite do it because there was so much knowledge that went into the Apollo program, and we don't have a lot of that knowledge anymore.
No.
Strangely enough.
In fact, I wonder whether Artemis is going to survive Elon Musk and Doge. There are lots of question marks over it at the moment. I think there's always been more of a romance about going to Mars than the moon. So that seems to be a likelier bet, I think, for the next big leap. But we've had some events with the museum with Lord Rees, who's the astronomer royal, and Martin is he's very anti-human and crude space flights because they do go wrong and people do die, but he doesn't mind if it's private entrepreneurs. So he's quite keen to encourage Elon Musk to get on that starship and head for Mars. But he thinks that the scientific way forward is to rely ever more on robotics and AI for exploration, and not send humans, and maybe focus on sorting out planet A rather than thinking about colonizing any planet B.
That's right. And there are a lot of thinkers who think about, if we actually encounter an extraterrestrial intelligence, we might be most likely to encounter a robotic extraterrestrial intelligence, because just like we have mostly sent robots in outer space, any biology-based civilization on other planets may have done the same thing. But I guess that maybe brings us back to these religious connotations that for some proponents of human space exploration, of manned spacecraft and so on, there are these sort of connections again to this American idea of manifest destiny, that we humans are destined to leave our planet. That we are destined to colonize the solar system, destined to colonize the stars. Mary Jane Rubenstein has written a book called Astrotopia, where she writes about these connections between space colonization thought and religious thought. So there's the idea that we as humans, we have to do that. We have to become interplanetary and multiplanetary. We can't just stay where we are. So it
It
almost
sounds
becomes
like the
like a religious
cosmos
mission.
all over again, you know.
That's right. Exactly. And sort of Rubinstein as well, she connects those to the history of maritime explorations on Earth, where it became almost like a religious mission for European empires to go out of Europe and to take lands elsewhere in the name of their crowns, but also in the name of the
Yeah.
Catholic Church in particular. And I mean, famously, a pope divided much of the extra-European world, the world outside of Europe, into a sphere for Spain and a sphere for Portugal, where it was their right to sort of colonize and proselytize there. And so there's, similar ideas perhaps among some proponents of human space exploration, that it is our right to sort of occupy Mars and bring our flag there and bring our consciousness there.
Yeah, no, and you're right. When you look at say the way that NASA is pivoting once again under Trump's first presidency. I remember talking to Charlie Bolden, who was the then head of NASA, how Earth observation was being scrapped and a new focus on exploration. And we're seeing exactly the same thing happening again, even to the point where you can't even discuss climate change anymore if you want any funding, which is, it sounds like some Orwell-esque sci-fi, coming true. But anyway, interesting times there. But I think we will see some maybe bolder missions. I suspect Artemis will end up on the scrap heap, and there'll be a bolder initiative and a shorter term one taking shape. And it goes back to Lord Rees's point that I think NASA can't afford to be a big risk taker. It's got to get it just right. The stakes are very high. It's hugely conservative, and really it's buccaneering entrepreneurs with a commercial motive that are probably going to take the big risks, not national space agencies. So it'd be interesting to see how much of the science fiction comes true in the next couple of decades or so. Like you, though, I'm a bit frustrated that space has proved much more difficult to explore than we thought in the heady days of the 60s.
Yeah, it will be interesting what will happen. Obviously, America is not the only player there. China is a very, very important player in terms of lunar exploration as well. And I've read arguments that say, well, the only thing that is needed is some kind of intelligence leak, perhaps, that the Chinese are building a city on Mars. And that information alone might be enough to then put billions, if not trillions, of dollars into sort of a competition with its Chinese sort of. Then, if the Chinese are going to Mars, then we have to go there also. If the Chinese are going to the moon, then we have to be there also. Maybe again, as a repetition of history, in the same way as these early modern European empires, where they were competing with one another. And their companies, right, like the British East India Company was competing with the Dutch East India Company, with French East India Company, and so on. So will be interesting whether SpaceX and whether Blue Origins will indeed engage in this international competition as well
Yeah.
with Chinese or Indian, etc., space rockets. And one has to see whether these explorers, these companies will behave better than their early modern colonizers.
I must say the thing though that most excites me, I mean, I find the kind of echoes of old colonialism a little bit sad in a way, but still the part of the mission that thrills me the most is the search for extraterrestrial life. And clearly on Mars there's still interest in, it was once a water world, and whether there's something bacterial or something microbial left there. And I can't help but feel, given how tough organisms are on Earth, these so-called extremophiles, that feels something that's likely to be found. And equally, we've got these amazing, a whole array of probes now that are capable of analyzing the atmosphere of exoplanets and detecting life signs. So I think it will be a big moment. And I'm thinking of the very first thing we talked about with the Quran's talking about many worlds. I mean, Matthias, what's your take on the prospect of finding good evidence that we're not alone in the universe? We won't talk about whether they're intelligent or not, because that's a whole new. But what are you excited by the prospects for the next few years?
Absolutely. This is an incredibly exciting time, both in terms of exoplanet research as well as in terms of solar system exploration. You mentioned Mars. Also of great interest are some of the moons in the outer solar system that might have oceans, liquid oceans under a crust of ice. Now, we know that pretty much wherever you have liquid water on Earth, you will have some kind of life form. So it would be very, very interesting to know whether in these liquid water oceans, especially at those places where there's a source of energy in terms of volcanoes and geysers, whether there might be life forms as well. You mentioned the atmospheres of exoplanets. Again, fascinating field of research. And we might not travel to these planets anytime soon, but we might find very, very strong indications, which, for instance, would be if we find O2, so just oxygen by itself. So any kind of pure oxygen that we find on Earth here is the product of biological processes. Plants produce O2 for the most part. So if we find an atmosphere of a planet with O2, that would be really a fascinating indication for possible life outside. Well, you mentioned intelligent life. That's obviously a whole different matter. We know that we have sentient beings here on our planet, whales, dolphins, a whole host of other planets that we have very great difficulty understanding the language of whales. So whether we would be able to make sense of the sentience or intelligence of other life forms, that's a whole different matter. But it would be very, very exciting. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
And it's also quite challenging, to be honest, for science communicators as well, right? But if you think about the COVID pandemic that we've all lived through, how much the COVID pandemic has been a challenge to science communicators, with so much fake news, so many different voices, so much hype about sort of maybe possible countermeasures, vaccines, etc., and sort of how to get the right information to the public. Now, if essentially one type of virus here on Earth can create such big challenges for science communicate a whole moon or a whole planet full of life forms would be even harder.
I totally agree. And I think there's lots of complicated issues that brings up. So for example, vaccine hesitancy and skepticism definitely correlates with trust in authorities and trust in the government. So if you've got a low respect for your government, then you are very worried about some sort of mass vaccination program. Also, it worries me that people, I do think the scientific method is still probably the most powerful way we've got to understand what's going on. And I do find it depressing that people now are just stating things as a bald truth when they're refutable in the strong sense, of the word. In fact, even AI I find a bit disturbing, because one of the problems with AI is that it gives you plausible answers, but at the moment it doesn't often explain how it got the answer. You don't get what are called mechanistic insights. AlphaFold won the Nobel Prize for Demis Hassabis and John Jumper, and it's definitely the most important bit of AI in science, but it doesn't really tell you how the AI understands how proteins fold. It just gives you the answers. And if you look under the bonnet of an AI like that, it's got colossal numbers of parameters. Most of them don't correlate with anything physical. They're just fitting parameters. So in a strange way, we're unraveling the scientific method, which is an endless dialogue between theory and data. And instead with AI, you train it on data and it gives you an answer.
That's
That's
right.
probably great on interpolation. Is it good at extrapolation? Not sure it is, really. There's lots of quite profound issues around AI that I don't think are being aired in an interesting way yet.
I couldn't agree more, right? And interestingly, you mentioned climate models earlier, right? So AI can give us wonderful simulations of climate, for instance, that are based on science, but the same sort of kind of AI perhaps could also, just generate a fake image of sort of just about anything. We're dealing with a kind of black box where we know what the output, maybe we know the input as well, but not anything that is actually going on, like how the input led to the output. We're a little bit better off than the people who constructed that supercomputer in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, who got the answer 42. So like them, sort of we kind of know the output, we know the 42. We're lucky in that maybe we know the prompt as well, the question, but we don't know all the calculations in between.
That's a very nice way of putting it. In fact, something my co-author, Peter Coveney, I've done 3 books with Peter, but he's very passionate about AI. This is possible. People are working on what's called explainable AI, or we call big AI, where you've got a combination of physics-based insights. In other words, common sense about how the world works, plus AI. And there are big advantages to AI, but again, the level of public discourse about it, just as you were saying with COVID and other big issues, it's surprising. Although I would say one thing about COVID, I wrote something like 130,000 words worth of blogs about COVID for the museum, long form Q&A format blogs. And we were amazed at the reader, there was a huge appetite to get information that felt that it came from scientists. It wasn't going through, for example, the Downing Street briefings were perfectly fine, but they were driven by political correspondence, not by science correspondence. So they're actually a bit all over the place in terms of understanding what was going on. So I'm not quite as much in despair over that as you might think. And actually, when writing the blogs, I did come across an interesting experiment where the idea of a fake news vaccine. This is a team at Cambridge who have got an app where you can create your own fake news. And of course, the whole secret of fake news is to come up with an intro and a headline that are so extraordinary that you've got to read on. And they found that if you encourage people to create their own fake news, they're much more. It acts like a vaccine. They actually, when they see fake news out in the wild, they're much better at detecting it. So maybe there'll be some sort of app to vaccinate us all against the ill effects of fake news in decades to come.
That's really great. I did not know about that essential experiment, but it's really wonderful. And I guess, yeah, Marie Curie once said that nothing in the world, I'm paraphrasing here, is to be feared. It is only to be understood. And so if people understand how the media work, how politics work, how the making of headlines work, and the making of fake news work, just maybe they can just get a better understanding and thereby also become immune to manipulation.
Yeah, I suppose if I had one last word to say on this, it would be to come up with the motto of the oldest scientific academy on the planet, or the oldest in continuous existence, the Royal Society, which is nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. And I think that very much applies to AI now, where you've got to cast a skeptical eye over it. And I suppose that would be my one plea. And where I do think that science and religion, unfortunately, do, it's don't rely on faith, rely on skepticism. So that's my take-home message.
That's right. And we are dealing with the world, obviously, in which we have big money, big corporations, right? AI is being promoted by very big companies that are promoting even bigger growth to investors, that are promising the universe to consumers. So one needs to have a healthy skepticism towards the big corporations, the big money streams involved here.
Well, I couldn't agree more, particularly since I think everything you've written and everything I've written has been illegally copied and then scraped to train some large language model somewhere without us getting any credit in the process whatsoever, which I do find rather depressing. But Matthias, it's such good fun to chat with you about this, and I think we should leave it there. That keep our viewers on the alert to keep skeptical. And, who knows where this great science adventure is going to take us.
Exactly. So be skeptical, but don't lose your excitement.
No.
We are in a very, very exciting moment in history where, yes, maybe we will find alien life sooner rather than later. Maybe we will indeed sort of get to these colonies on Mars or the moon, or we will maybe build computers in a way that we could have never imagined earlier. We are living in a fantastic world where one can be skeptical but hopefully optimistic at the same time.
I think we should very final thing, we should agree that we'll have the same chat in 20 years' time, and hopefully one of us will be on Mars by then, and we'll be talking to each other through Vint Cerf's interplanetary internet. So I hope to see you then.
I can't wait. Thank you so much, Roger.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.